Some far more substantial previews to the Grey Knights today. We have some big buffs for Dreadknights, a new army-wide special rule, and a very solid buff to the mighty Hammer Hand power. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy-focused 40k channel, where this week we've been talking about the leaks and reveals for the Grey Knights, and Games Workshop have really given us quite a lot of info to go on today. We'll start out talking about the Dreadknight, then talking about their very nice whole army buff, the Aegis, then go on to the new version of Hammerhand, Astral Aim, and a few stratagems. So first up, here we have the Nemesis Dreadknight. We've already seen in the points cost for chapter approved it is going down to 120 points from 135, so it's already looking a little bit more efficient than it previously was, though admittedly at that cost it doesn't come with any gear, that's before any guns or swords or things. Games Workshop have let slip a few other buffs it's going to get though. Its base profile is going to gain 1 extra attack, so up to 5 base, though I do suspect that will come with the loss of shock assault across the Grey Knight army. It's not 100% confirmed yet, but I strongly suspect it to be the case, much like Death Guard just rolling shock assault into just being 1 extra attack on the profile, and that is technically a buff, as you'll get it all the time rather than some of the time. Perhaps more relevantly though is that the Greatsword is looking like a bit of a better weapon. Rather than just having its big anti-vehicle damage mode, it's also going to pick up an alternative sweep mode. The standard profile is going to be staying at strength plus 4, so usually strength 10, AP minus 3 and damage d6, but the sweep mode is going to go to strength user, AP minus 2 and damage 2, but you get double the attacks, so you'd get 10 of those. Could be pretty good if you are looking at clearing out some 2-wound Space Marines, or just any lighter chaff horde. I think it's quite a good addition, to be honest. It always feels a bit silly when you have these really big monsters and threatening things, and without an alternative attack mode, it just feels a bit weird having them so held up by just a few infantry. Greatsword does appear to be going up in cost a bit. It now costs 15 rather than 5. Obviously we'll have to compare it to the other options, but I am hopeful that it will be quite a competitive choice now. Getting the flexibility of attacks is really quite a big deal when you don't always have all that much control of what you're charging into. Next up, we know that it's getting a buff to its invul save as well. It's going to go down to a 4+ invul rather than the 5+, which would make it a fair bit more tanky against any high AP fire, things like lance shots and the like. With the reduction in points cost, I do kind of wonder whether we might see less wounds on the Dreadknight. It currently has 12, and if it does remain at its current stat line with 12 wounds at toughness 6 and a 2+ save, we're looking at a really tanky thing for the cost. On the face of it, they're looking really quite threatening. It's going to be interesting to see the full picture when we have the rules in full. Finally, they have also picked up a new stratagem, 1 command point for Thunderous Stride. This one's a fairly standard looking impact hits type stratagem. You pay 1 command points and roll a dice when you make a successful charge. On a 2 to 5 the enemy takes d3 mortal wounds, and on a 6 you get a flat 3. Don't really know exactly how often that's going to be used. I guess maybe when you want absolute maximal damage out of the Dreadknight, but I imagine there's going to be quite a lot of times where you can just rely on the damage that the Dreadknight's going to do to get the job done. In any case, looks like things are looking pretty hopeful for these guys, and it'll be interesting to weigh them up against the Grandmaster version, which is often taken a bit more at the moment. Next up, we have the Aegis, which is an army-wide special rule for the Grey Knights, and I believe this is just a flat-out new rule and a straight-up buff to the army against some of their most hated foes. First up, they get a 5+ feel no pain type save against mortal wounds. On a 5 you ignore the damage. That's really quite a solid survivability buff, adds up to an extra 50% toughness against mortal wounds in total, and it's really quite relevant just with the sheer prevalence of mortal wounds in 9th edition. It does seem to be deliberate game design that Games Workshop is trying to give every army an access to mortal wounds if they want to use them, with things like the Drakari eviscerating flyby, or the Orc impact hits from their squigs and things. It's definitely not quite as situational as it was when they were a lot more limited to mainly Psykers. With Grey Knights and Thousand Sons being about though, it's certainly no bad thing either. In addition to that, they also get a +1 to deny the witch across the board. It does kind of make sense from a fluff standpoint, but it means they're going to be an absolute nightmare to fight if you are taking Psykers. Almost every Grey Knight unit is a Psyker, so they're going to be great at denying the witch anyway, and to give them a flat +1 across the board means they're going to be so much more reliable at doing so. Previously, I believe the Aegis was a 2 command point stratagem to deny the witch on a 3d6. Certainly gave you a fairly reliable deny, but having to fork out a massive 2 CP for it meant that it just wasn't really often worth it. In general, this is just going to be a solid boost to the Grey Knights, particularly against Psykers, which I feel does make sense lore-wise. It's not all good news though, as it does seem that Astral Aim, one of their psychic powers, has received a fairly hefty nerf. This was the one that allowed Grey Knights units to target units with their weapons that weren't even visible to them, and also ignore any benefits of light cover to boot. It was really handy on things like purgation squads, or maybe even big massive blobs of Terminators or Paladins, where you could combine it with other options to really stack their shooting very high, and then absolutely guarantee that you can get it off on the right target due to this power. The ignores line of sight thing is straight up gone. The ignores cover thing has been improved a bit. It's now just ignores all benefit of cover, not just light cover, so it'll ignore dense cover as well. And that is pretty relevant in 9th edition to be fair. You also get an extra hit reroll thrown in, so a tiny damage boost to the unit. It'll matter most on stronger shots, which to be honest isn't the best really, as most Grey Knight shooting is a lot of volume fire. I suppose rerolling a hit on a Psy Cannon or something isn't the worst. But interestingly, you can now no longer put this on other units nearby, it would seem. It has to be cast by the Psyker's own unit. It means that you'd actually be wanting to take this on something like a Purgation Squad, for example, and then they can happily have that as basically their power that they're just going to try and cast all game long to make their shooting just a little bit more efficient. It is a bit of a nerf though, as it means you can't just have this power on a character nearby a bunch of shooting units, decide which one they want to cast it on, while the other units use Smite or something. If Hammerhand is anything to go by, it might be a bit of a trend through the Sanctic discipline. Talking of which, Hammerhand has seen a big buff to its damage output, though again it does only affect the Psyker's own unit now, so you're basically going to want this on your fighting melee Grey Knights. Previously this was +1 to wound rolls with their attack, which was nice and everything, but now instead of that we've got a big full rerolls to wound ability on the go, which is going to be absolutely devastating. We already saw last weekend just how many attacks and the damage of the attacks that the Grey Knight strike squads will put out. Every model is going to have 3 attacks base, and if you just take the swords then they're all going to be strength 5, AP -3 and damage 2. So if you do manage to stack that with a reroll wound roll as well, they're going to be wounding even things that are toughness 8 most of the time, and if they're targeting something like Space Marines, they'd be wounding them 8 times out of every 9. Hammerhand honestly seems so powerful right now. For any sort of Grey Knight combat unit, I think it's going to be a definite one to think about. The potential that you could have with this going off on a huge unit of Terminators or something is really quite scary. Again though, just a little bit annoying that you can't cast it on a unit at will. It looks like Psykers might be going a bit more for the Dominus discipline now, and the regular troops will be taking these Sanctic powers. Finally, we come to a trio of stratagems, just a few out of a presumably fairly long list, but I guess it's kind of interesting to see as a bit of a taster. For 2 CP we have Steely Advance. This is a counts as stationary bonus. You use it in the movement phase after making a normal move, and then you count as having remained stationary for the rest of the turn. It means that you'll be able to move and fire your heavy weapons such as Psy Cannons, and potentially get Bolter Discipline off on any Storm Bolters on Strike Marines even if they move. For 2 CP it is a fairly pricey one to be honest. I think it's not always going to be worth it just for the raw damage output, but if you both absolutely have to move a unit and also want absolute maximum damage dealing, then this could be worth it to try and gain a swing over your opponent. Next we have Sanctified Kill Zone for 2 CP. This one's locked to the Purgation squads, but it's really quite an efficient damage dealing boost as you get a nice +1 to wound from it. You do have to be in half range, so it's not quite de-restricted, and you're rarely going to be able to use this efficiently on Incinerators unless you're getting very close indeed. But for Storm Bolters, Psy Cannons and Silencers, this seems like it's really good. None of those weapons are particularly high strength, so you could potentially have a bunch of Silencers wounding Space Marines on 3s, or even just 10 Storm Bolters with +1 to wound does seem at least like fairly scary in theory. I think that could be well worth the 2 command point stratagem if you build around it, and it's going to be interesting to see what other Psy weapon synergies they have in the new codex. I'm sure Psybolt ammunition for the Storm Bolters will be returning in some form. If you could combine that with this, then potentially you could have an absolute devastating amount of Storm Bolter fire coming out of the squad. Finally for 1 CP we have Steel Heart, a Terminator buff. It's a fairly standard +1 to hit, but it does appear to be only in melee for some reason, as opposed to the more de-restrictive version that most Space Marines get. So a little bit more limited there, but again could certainly be a massive damage increase if used on a big unit. A nice one to have the option to go to if you are fighting a combat that you think is going to be close. They have confirmed that as expected Terminators will be getting 3 wounds, so that's certainly going to make them more tempting in the new book. So plenty of tasty stuff there. Going to be interesting to try and put this all together with a review of the codex, which I should hopefully have coming out on Monday, all things going well. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see that. Finally, if you would like to help keep these videos coming, I'd just like to mention that the channel has a Patreon page, and you can find that down in the video description below. Making all the videos does take a fair amount of time, so if you are enjoying regularly, any support is massively appreciated. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry to the regular prize giveaways, with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, then the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.